I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we analyse the news of a missile strike in Poland close to the Ukrainian border, discuss the diplomatic moves made at the G20 in Indonesia, and we interview politics professor Dr Olga Onuch about Ukrainian politics, society and democracy.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 16th of November, day 266. And today, I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nichols, our senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, our assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, and our guest today is author and academic Dr Olga Onuch, senior lecturer in politics at the University of Manchester, and whose upcoming book, The Zelensky Effect, tells the story of Ukraine through the journey of the man who has come to symbolise his country. I started by asking Roland for the latest news from Ukraine and Poland.
Good morning. There's two things on my rather busy plate. The first and most dramatic, I suppose, is this explosion, this missile strike accident impact in Poland, about 4 miles from the Ukrainian border. Very dramatic. Happened last night. A lot of confusion. Initially thought it might have been a Russian missile because it happened basically at the same time as Russia was hurling this absolutely enormous wave of missiles at Ukraine, probably their biggest single strike since the war began. So, in the region of 100 cruise missiles all over the country, targeting energy infrastructure. Something landed in Poland. It now looks like it was probably a Ukrainian air defense missile launched to intercept an incoming Russian missile that went off course. 2 people were killed in Poland. That is massively significant, really, because this is the first time the war has genuinely spilt over onto NATO territory. This is probably not an Article 5 moment. This is not the beginning of World War II. It does look like accidental spillover. It doesn't look like Russia deliberately launched an attack on a NATO member, in which case, I would be advising you to tell your children you loved them and, making your peace with God. But that nonetheless is a major incident. Two NATO citizens killed on NATO territory as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we're going to see some pretty serious diplomatic fallout from that. The other thing, this happened just as the G20 summit in Bali was breaking up. Or breaking up, it was kind of going into its last stages. It has finally broken up this morning. The leaders are slowly getting on planes and leaving. It caused a bit of chaos down there. Joe Biden convened a kind of emergency summit of the other NATO and G7 members who were present at the summit. Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, was meant to meet Xi Jinping this afternoon. That's being called off. We're not quite sure why. It might have something to do with all the chaos sparked by that, and so on. Interestingly, the final communique is out from the G20, and that is, in diplomatic terms, it's something of one in the eye for Russia, really. A kind of surprisingly strong language. I'm just going to, if you give me 2 seconds, get up the text on my phone. So, quite high up in the 16-page document, the leaders say they basically restate a UN resolution that, quote, deplores in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, demands its complete and unconditional withdrawal from the territory of Ukraine. Goes on. Most members strongly condemned the war in Ukraine and stressed it is causing immense human suffering and exacerbating existing fragilities in the global economy. And then they list food, energy, health issues, all the things that are suffering as a knock-on effect from the war. Now, there are clear caveats in there. Most members, and not everybody, and it also notes there were other views and different assessments. But nonetheless, when you've got a forum where China, India, Who else has had a slightly ambivalent position on this war? I mean, Brazil's Lula. He said, look, you've got to look at things from the Russian point of view. South Africa, Saudi Arabia, all these countries that are not part of the global West, not part of the grand American alliance, and who Western diplomats have been wooing for ages, saying, look, come off the fence. We understand you've got your own interests here, but you've got to either get on side with us, or you've at least got to use your influence with the Russians to restrain them. This is a breakthrough for that policy. It's pretty strong language, really, and I think that's partly a result of the Russians basically ceding space. Vladimir Putin refused to go to this summit. He sent Sergei Lavrov instead. Sergei Lavrov stayed for one day, and he left yesterday afternoon, and he's left Anton Siluanov, the finance minister, in charge. So, there wasn't really anyone to fight Russia's corner anyway. But still fascinating. I mean, this is Emmanuel Macron at his press conference at the end of the session earlier today, just before he headed back to Paris. Quote, "I'm convinced China can play on our side a more important mediating role in the coming months, to prevent, in particular, a stronger return of ground assaults in early February." Now, that to me is fascinating, because he met Xi Jinping yesterday. He's basically saying, he's implying that they've discussed the idea of Beijing becoming a mediator, taking a role that Turkey's been playing earlier in the war, and also specifically talking about preventing a return to intensified combat operations in February, which really echoes those odd reports we've had from the United States recently about, talking about a winter lull. Maybe the winter lull can help us get diplomacy going. There's definitely something going on there, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that, Roland. Francis, I know you had some thoughts on this. Do you want to come in?
Well, thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. I apologise in advance if my signal or audio quality is less than optimal. I'm currently halfway up an ancient volcano, and I'm supposed to be on holiday, but the news last night brought me and I think everyone else back down to earth. I'm only going to speak very briefly. For the reasons that Roland's just highlighted, it goes without saying that this is not only a highly precarious moment, but a significant one for the shape of the war to come in the coming months. My first thought, however, is just with the Ukrainians who have been suffering horrifically in the last 24 hours. I mean, as Roland was saying, the nature of these attacks are absolutely vicious, and clearly the Russians have been holding back weaponry in order to launch this attack, timed with the summits that we've been describing this week. But in terms of the significance of the strike itself, that's hit and killed 2 people in Poland, whoever is responsible for this will face consequences as a result. For Russia, if it is them, and as I say, it seems more likely it's Ukraine at this point by accident, but if it were Russia, then the consequences would be more obvious. It would be further condemnation and military support for Ukraine. But if Ukraine is responsible, then I think the consequences will be less clear. One can see it going one of 2 ways. Either it focuses minds in Europe that this war is still very much going on, and will make those powers want to end it by providing further military support for Ukraine. There's some evidence that that's what certain of the Baltic states are reacting to this. But it could also trigger a nervousness in the West and in Europe that this war cannot be allowed to endure indefinitely, for fear that something worse could happen that will drag other countries into the conflict. So if that argument is true, then I think we can expect there to be shifts in the diplomatic sphere, and as Roland was saying, I think we're already seeing some evidence for this. If you look at Macron's remarks about China, absolutely incredible, really, in the context of this, to be saying that China are going to be paying overtures, because the only way that they would be doing that, essentially, is to try and broker some sort of deal, I think, that would end the war before Ukraine launches some other major significant counter-offensive, and who knows what the consequences of that will be, but you can imagine that it wouldn't be one that would necessarily please the Ukrainians. So I was also quite struck by the remarks of the Kremlin in response to Biden's statement, saying that he thought that the evidence suggested that it was an accidental missile fired by Ukraine. They praised him quite strongly for his remarks and for not jumping to conclusions, essentially. And I think that, again, it's indicative of Russia are looking for some kind of off-ramp here, that if they were able to keep the annexed territories, then that for them would be seen as a victory. And the question now is how much Western resolve is going to hold on saying that that cannot be allowed to happen. But anyway, just to conclude, underlining all of this is the fundamental point that war is ultimately unpredictable, and that those who are making the calculations now really never know the equations that matter on a day-to-day basis. This event that we've just described, it could change nothing, but it could change everything. And that, in that regard, I think that it's absolutely right that we focus on it very much in detail today.
Well, thank you, Francis, and thank you, Roland. Dom, can I come to you next before we introduce our guest, Olga? Dom, you've had an interesting morning. Where have you been and what have you learnt?
Yeah, good morning. Good afternoon, sorry. Hi, everybody. I've been out all morning. I've been locked up in the journalist spa, which is basically MI5, because you have to go in there, turn your phone off, nobody can ring you, you can't get hassled by the news desk, etc., etc. So it's a lovely haven of peace and tranquility. But I was there for this year's annual Director General of MI5 threat speech, and I was just going to give you a quick tour around the bazaars. It's out embargo till 1 o'clock, so it's out now. You'll see it online and other carriers. Although, why would you go there? We're also covering the story. But I mean, Ken McCullum, the Director General of MI5, he was very forthright, as you'd expect, about the threats to the UK and to our wider sort of partners. Interestingly, slightly segue away from Russia first, if I may. He was talking about Iran, and he was saying how the Iranian intelligence services are, quote, a sophisticated adversary. And he said, this is a quote, "We know that over many years they've sometimes operated using their own operatives, doing things with their own hands, and on other occasions they've co-opted other people to work on their behalf. From some of what we've seen across the continent of Europe over the last decade, at times they're prepared to take reckless actions. At times they will take action in Western countries, and at other times they will seek to lure people to other parts of the world, including Iran itself. It's a combination of tactics," unquote. And what he was referring to there, in the speech he talked about a risk in the UK, and he said that there had been plans to kill British citizens and UK-based individuals who are enemies of the Iranian regime. He said there have been 10 such plots of this since January this year, 10 plots to kill British people and other nationalities on British soil by the Iranian intelligence services. And he said, another quote, "We work at pace with domestic and international partners to disrupt this completely unacceptable activity." I thought that was really interesting how he came out very, very strongly about Iran then. On Russia, I mean, as you'd expect, he covered a whole range of issues there. He talked about the international efforts earlier this year after the February 24th invasion, where 600 Russian officials were kicked out of Europe and he said over 400 of whom are now judged to be spies. He derided as silly, quote unquote silly, Russia's claim that Britain was responsible for the Nord Stream attack back in September, I think 26th of September, back into September. But he said, quote, "The serious point is that the UK must be ready for Russian aggression for years to come." I'm going to carry on the quote. "Some of that will be covert aggression for MI5 to tackle and defeat, but much of it, as currently with energy levers, will be overt." He also highlighted, interestingly, the threat from what he called Putin-aligned oligarchs, who would be used as tools of influence in the UK. And then I don't know if he's a big fan of football or quite, if it's just because the World Cup's coming out. But he then launched into this really pretty clunky football analogy. He said Russia thinks nothing of throwing an elbow in the face and routinely cheats to get its way. And routinely cheats to get its way. We've had success in getting some of their players sent off. And for now, they're a bit distracted by the blame game in their own dressing room, but they'll keep attacking us. The Chinese authorities present a different order of challenge. They're trying to rewrite the rule book, to buy the league, to recruit our coaching staff to work for them. And Iran will only let people support one team and is prepared to use violence against those who don't toe the line. I mean, crikey, it was a little bit laboured by the end of that. But it was very interesting. He talked about China, kept talking interesting language from the British government over the last 24 hours. There was a suggestion that in the the brief period of Liz Truss's premiership, when the integrated review, the integrated the foreign security defence and development review, cross-government review that came out last year, February. February. Was it this year or last year? I'll have to go back and look at it. But the current sort of state of Britain's security and defence and development foreign policy is being refreshed at the moment, partly in light of the February 24th invasion, but also the rise of China. And Liz Truss we thought Liz Truss might call China a threat. Now that language has been dialed back slightly. Some are calling it a U-turn, but I think that's just politics, because she was only in power for 46 days, for God's sake, so it's not really a U-turn. And her language was a bit of an outlier. So Ken McCullum, Director General of MI5, he kept talking about China being a strategic challenger and so on and so forth. I did ask him in questions, I said, what does China have to do to move from being a strategic challenger to being a threat? And he gave a very eloquent, quite lengthy and very opaque answer that didn't give me any answer whatsoever. But they were talking about the threat from these Chinese police stations that we've seen around the world, whereby they're seeking to extend their influence using the United Front Work Department and other organisations that apply pressure to the Chinese diaspora and anyone who seems to be challenging Beijing's what they perceive as their core interests, either through Hong Kong, Xinjiang, whatever. And he said we can expect to see these kind of activities increase further as Xi Jinping consolidates his power on what Ken McCullum said was an indefinite basis. So it was there's nothing massively new there, apart from the Iran stuff. We're going to have a much longer piece up online a bit later. We've got the first toe in the water now for the 1 o'clock embargo, and a longer story in the paper tomorrow. But it was a good tour around the major threats. He touched on terrorism as well, right-wing and Islamic-inspired terrorism. No massive changes there. Right-wing extremism seems to be on the increase slightly, but no huge changes there. But state threats, he said, that's where a lot of effort, and he wouldn't put any figures on this, but the increase in the activity is going towards state threats. So I think the majority of MI5's work is on counter-terrorism still, and of that, the vast majority, 75%. Was a figure we've been used in the past, is on Islamic-inspired terrorism, extremism, vice right-wing and others. But of those, of the increasing threats, state threats is massively outpacing what is perceived as any increase in counter-terrorism. But there'll be more to say online and in print tomorrow.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dom. I thought that gave us quite a good overview, given what Roland was saying earlier about the diplomatic moves at the G20. Francis, I know you've just got one quick thing that I'll ask you all for any final updates before we go to Olga.
Thank you, David. Yes, just a very quick one, if I may. I've just seen a story that Germany has finished the construction of its first import terminal for liquefied natural gas. Now, this is really significant because, as we've talked about at length in many, many months now, Germany's capacity and response to the energy crisis is really critical for the whole of Europe's response. And as you can imagine, the fact that they've managed to build this import hub that will be able to store considerable amounts of liquefied gas for not only for Germany, but hopefully for the rest of Europe as well, in about 200 days, is a really crucial milestone in efforts to end not only Germany's energy dependency on Russia, but wider in Europe as well. And I think it speaks ultimately to a fundamental point here, which is about adaptability. Democracies have an ability to adapt quite quickly to changes in policy direction in a manner that autocracies quite often are not able to do so. And I think as we go into the coming weeks and months and into the winter, the fact that we can see Germany having done this, there's also movements in France and in Britain as well to be doing similar storage. I think actually within the next few months, and indeed if we're thinking longer term as well, the key card that Putin had to play on the energy front will have evaporated almost entirely in terms of dependency. Of course, there will still be a desire, I think, in many European countries to still be purchasing some energy from Russia. One can make of that what you will. But the dependency issue, I think, will have been greatly reduced. And that's going to have a big influence. So, as I say, a minor story in the grand scheme compared to all of the things we've been talking about already, but still a significant one, I think, because this crucial energy front, it plays an enormous role here. And as I say, Germany have managed to build this in about 200 days, which is no mean feat.
Well, thank you very much, Francis, Roland and Dom. If there are no further updates, I think this is a perfect moment to bring in our guest. Thank you very much for your time, Olga. Thank you for coming to talk to us. Would you just start by introducing yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been working on.
Thank you, David. So I have been working on Ukrainian politics. I am myself also Ukrainian for the better half of the last 16 years, specifically looking at the way that ordinary Ukrainians engage in electoral or protest politics, how they come to identify with the Ukrainian state, what determines their language use and how they feel about it. But also more broadly now their engagement and mobilization in the war currently today, and obviously covering a lot of the political elite machinations along the way.
Well, can we start? Could you paint us a bit of a picture of Ukrainian politics then? So since independence, who should we know about? Who are the major players, the parties? What are the big dividing lines, and how have they shifted since independence?
Right, just 30 years of politics in a sentence or two, right?
Sorry, yes, and it's a big question. Yeah.
But of course, it depends what angle you want to come at this from, right? And for a person like me who studies how citizens behave, I certainly think that the Ukrainian electorate is quite an important actor that is often actually overlooked, and specifically in security analyses. Quite frankly, a lot of the misunderstandings of how well Ukrainians will fight and defend their state, specifically across the southeast of Ukraine, was in great part done as a result of misunderstanding this Ukrainian electorate that has been fiercely attached to this civic notion of what it means to be Ukrainian. And they have repeatedly stood up against various increasingly authoritarian figures that were trying to install their chosen successors, or in the case of Yanukovych, President Viktor Yanukovych in 2013-14, who started to shoot at peaceful protesters. So I think it's always important to start off with that very formidable group. In fact, that is I think the main the leading role is played by ordinary citizens, including in our book, The Zelensky Effect. But as Henry in my book kind of gives away a hint, the Zelensky Effect is very much also about political leaders, such as Zelensky himself. But in the last 30 years, his generation was very late to come actually to the halls of power in the Ukrainian parliament or in government. Those people that are now about in their 40s. We, for the last 30 years, really saw this pre-independent generation of power brokers in Ukraine. A group of key oligarchs, and we can start listing names, but certainly the former president, Petro Poroshenko, was one of those, including others, Viktor Pinchuk, Akhmetov, certainly Kolomoisky, who many have heard about. And they came to not only rule economic and industry avenues in Ukraine, but also in great part politics. But also obviously on the elite politics side, we've had some key players, be they the former presidents, Kravchuk, Kuchma, Yushchenko, or prime ministers such as Yulia Tymoshenko, at one point Viktor Yanukovych, then before he became president, and currently Shmyhal, who is the prime minister of Ukraine.
So there's an awful lot to get into here. It's very interesting. Thank you so much for that, Olga. Just quickly, for listeners outside of Ukraine, how is can you tell us a little bit about how politics is done? What's the structure of the legislature? And it's unicameral. What does that mean? Can you tell us a little bit about how Ukrainian politics works day to day?
Well, the official line of how politics works and the unofficial line of how politics works. So we can talk about the Verkhovna Rada, which is the parliament, and that is a unicameral structure. It's one legislative structure in Ukraine, and that it has 450 seats. That the current president's party, Servant of the People, has an outright majority in 238. This was, quite frankly, an astounding victory in the legislature in 2019, something we haven't seen up until this point in time. Not only have we never seen a political party that to gain an outright majority in this way, we have also never seen a president that had a party that had a majority that did not have to broker deals with other parties in order to get his policies passed. So that gives a little bit of a hint as to how politics was done in the past. A lot of folks focus on the fact that Servant of the People, the party in power, is a personalized party, obviously that of the president, tied to his image and even his television show that he starred in prior to becoming president. But that's only part of the story. It's certainly not the only such party. In fact, all of the major parties in Ukraine, be they a European solidarity that is associated with the former president Petro Poroshenko, who remains its leader, or Holos, that was founded by a famous musician, although it is now led by Kira Rudik. Batyushchina, Yulia Tymoshenko's party, and currently led by her as well. They have all been personalistic parties. And they have all been attached to one key political mega player, as well as one or two or three key oligarchs that were seen as main backers or directly connected with these parties. So for a very long time, parliamentary legislative politics were done through, quite frankly, a lot of behind the doors, backroom deals that were struck by the political elite and oligarchs. And then those who were MPs in parliament were forced to vote in ways that their leader and the oligarch backing their party approved of. That changed a little bit since 2014, certainly with the entry of new faces and so-called Euro-optimists, again, folks that are part of this independence generation that are in their 40s and that have slightly different values and that grew up in a very different Ukraine. They've been fighting back against this old entrenched group that likes to do things through informal politics, pressure, and oligarchic control. Certainly something that the president, Zelensky, has been trying to combat in great deal in Ukraine with his de-oligarchization law.
So before we go to President Zelensky and your book, The Zelensky Effect, could you just give us a sense? Because I think why this is really useful and interesting is you're painting a picture of Ukraine for us to understand much better and deeper the country and its politics. Can you talk a little bit about the political landscape just before the war? What are the major policy issues? What are people talking about? What's on the government's agenda?
Well, certainly, and when you say before the war, you mean before February?
Sorry, before the full-scale invasion. Sorry, yes.
Because we need, for those of us who are Ukrainian, we have the war started in 2014 for us, and I'm pretty sure you agree. But yes, before the all-out full-scale invasion by Russia on February 24th, 2022, we have to remember that Ukraine was already in the midst of a war, that Ukraine was having difficulty economically throughout. Actually, poverty peaked in 2015 and then had slight improvements until 2019. And then, of course, the pandemic hit and really had a dramatic effect on everyday lives in Ukraine. But also that there was a pandemic, right? And that certainly prevented the government to go, and specifically the president's party, to go full scale with some of their policies that they may have perhaps intended to go forward with prior to the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, March 2020. But the main policy, there were incredible series of policies that were being passed and continued and expanded from Poroshenko's time. So here Poroshenko deserves a great deal of credit. His party and his government started reforms such as decentralization, providing greater control at smaller localities where citizens were more engaged in local politics and in their localities' budgets. Also, major reforms of the army, and then later language law reforms. Interestingly, when Zelensky, who was a noted Russian speaker who produced so much of his entertainment outputs in Russian, when he came to power, he continued, he did not oppose, he did not change, he continued Poroshenko's the language laws that he reforms. He also continued and expanded greatly the decentralization reforms. And then again, in 2021, 2020, picked up and expanded the army reforms. So these were very important. But Zelensky was able to achieve a few other really important policies that were controversial, that were perhaps passed through in controversial ways. But one of this is the land reform laws that will hopefully in the future allow Ukraine to do a variety of reforms when it comes to the purchase, sale, and usage of agricultural land. Another major reform that Zelensky was able to push through with his majority of 238 deputies in parliament, he was able to push through this nedotorkanist, that deputy immunity, canceling deputy immunity, which was so difficult to do for so many years. And several predecessors tried to push this policy through. If you have extremely corrupt individuals that are taking bribes in order to be part of parties and in order to vote a certain way for decades, that obviously creates shambolic and chaotic politics. But if you're able to cancel deputy immunity and ensure that people will be prosecuted for such crimes, that is an incredible step towards really, truly a liberal democracy in Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Olga, for that. I thought that was incredibly comprehensive. Just quickly, we were talking about President Zelensky. What else do you think we should know about him in the West that's more than just sort of the charismatic war leader? I mean, you've painted a very full picture, but I'm curious. You've mentioned some of his big policy successes. Have there been failures? What do Ukrainians criticize him for?
Okay, well, first we'll talk about what should he be known for, and I think there's a few things here that I particularly find fascinating about the way we talk about President Zelensky, the way we talk about him prior to becoming president. And we detail this in the Zelensky Effect book, which, by the way, also covers the last 30 years of politics, but in more depth than I was able to do in those few minutes earlier, and covers all these policy reforms, as well as some potential failures of Zelensky's. But the thing that really irks me, David, and the thing that I'm shocked constantly when people do not refer to this, is that he was the general producer of one of the most important and, in fact, the most viewed television networks in Ukraine. And this was a television network that was Inter, that was also associated with a key oligarch, not the oligarch he was then later thought to be connected to when he was running for president and thereafter. But his role as general producer of a major television network, even if he kept saying that he did not involve himself in the news desk politics and all this stuff, it meant that he was a major player in Ukrainian society and politics. And in fact, far more important member of the elite than I think people are giving him credit for, but also perhaps looking into how that came to be, how he behaved in that role, and if there's anything else there. So he's certainly not a novice in 2019 or on that New Year's Eve address when he declares himself to be a candidate for presidency. In fact, he is a well-heeled member and part of the establishment. What was different, of course, about Zelensky was that he played a president on TV. So we call this in the book virtual incumbency of Zelensky's, because most people probably saw him playing president on television more than they saw Petro Poroshenko on television as the real president, right? So it was a very masterful campaigning and coming to be president. I think that most people miss, and they just underestimated him as an entertainer and comedian and so forth. But in terms of policy, I think the big successes are often underreported. So I think the big successes of 2019 to 2022, they are underreported. They are underdiscussed. The fact, I don't think I don't think praise should only go to him, but also his team. But the failures and the problems also need to be raised. One of those is that he had a very difficult time putting together some of his team. Certainly, we know through our interviews with individuals off the record and on the record that a lot of people declined major roles in government, cabinet, running different institutions, and so on and so forth, because they had a very partisan view of Zelensky. And that was I think, a mistake that a lot of people are going to look at, that they did not join these institutions in 2019. But because of that, I think servant of the people and Zelensky and government did have to, in some cases, look to put people in posts that perhaps were not quite ready for those posts, or maybe had a little bit more of a complicated history and CV, shall we say that, that some people call them as dark figures or so on. I think that certainly happened. There were cases that were reported in the media, but in all of these instances, these individuals were reprimanded or taken out of post. And I think Zelensky was quite ardent on cleaning house where and when he could, and when the opportunity arose, including when people made mistakes. He gave people chances several times, but then when, third strike and you're definitely out, and in fact, in maybe a very even public way in some instances. Beyond that, there's obviously potential criticism around some of the centralization of power that is happening in a wartime. Individuals like myself think that that is perhaps a necessary reality of wartime leadership. What we really will see is how Zelensky goes forward, not only as a wartime president, but then thereafter, how he manages power, how he is able to share power, and how he is able to work with opposition going forward.
Thanks, Olga. I've just got two more questions from me. Then I know Francis, Dom and Roland, I'm sure, will have questions as well. Moving away from Zelensky, I read a recent paper of yours about democracy in Ukraine and how Ukrainians, you say, have been steadily rallying around democracy in recent years, especially sort of since the pandemic. I thought that was very interesting, and it stands in opposition to other countries we could talk about. Can you talk us through what you found?
Yeah, so this is why I started with, the main political actor in Ukraine being those ordinary citizens, those ordinary Ukrainians. It's really wild when you start paying attention to them. First off, we have been, as part of this Mobilize project, and again, we detail this in the article in Journal of Democracy, but also in the Zelensky Effect, we talk about how Ukrainians rallied around democracy and why that is the case. But as part of our project that's based at the University of Manchester, Mobilize, we have been surveying ordinary Ukrainians over the last 3-4 years. And we do this in a panel format. So that means we go and re-interview the same people over time. So we're getting around a lot of issues. You do not always know if a trend is a trend or if it's something in partly connected to the sample. But here we are pretty clear that individuals change their position on key things. And one of those key things that they change their position on is support for democracy, or believing that democracy is the best system for Ukraine. In 2019, just about 40% of the Ukrainian population thought that democracy was the best system for the country. Others thought that, authoritarian system would be better. Others thought for people like me, it doesn't matter. And others still thought that it was hard to say. That group always baffled me, because if after 30 years you still find it's hard to say whether a democracy is good, that's quite the puzzle. And that was right before Zelensky was elected, 2019. And then we started looking at our data. Each and every year, we saw an uptick. More and more people in our sample started to move to believe that democracy is the best system for Ukraine. And our last pre-all-out invasion survey ended on February 16th, 2022. And when I saw that data, I started really freaking out, thinking that there's a huge error. And we started running all sorts of analytical robustness checks, because we found that near 60% of the Ukrainian population said that they supported democracy, from 40 to 60. After the all-out invasion, that moved to about 74% of the Ukrainian population. I have looked through all of the democratization data research out there. I tried to find any country where we saw the support for democracy jump so quickly amongst individuals, and individuals changing their position. I can't find anything like that. And what's connected to it? Well, a few things. So these people also think, they also come to think that EU accession is the way to go. These people also come to think that NATO membership is the way to go for Ukraine as a preferred policy. And these people also come to have a stronger sense of civic duty, which we measure in a variety of ways. They tend to be actually from the southeast of Ukraine, the movers. They tend to be also among Russian speakers from the southeast of Ukraine. So it's very interesting that it's exactly this group of ordinary Ukrainians that perhaps Putin was counting on in February that were already moving to supporting democracy prior to the war. But what really, really shocked me when we did our analyses is that having voted for a servant of the people, the president's party, actually increased the likelihood that an individual would move to support democracy. Now, why is that the case? I think that they saw that not only a party can deliver on some key electoral promises, but also that the president was in fact embodying and amplifying a civic identity amongst Ukrainians, and that they began to see themselves as part of that Ukrainianness. And finally, I think that very much they also noted that Zelensky did not overturn his predecessors' policies and laws. The first thing that Zelensky did when he came to power, he did not overturn the language law that everyone thought he might, right? So really, they saw democracy working and they came to rally it. Who came to rally before February 24th? Those were folks who found it hard to say. And those were folks that previously thought the authoritarian system was the best one. After the all-out invasion of Ukraine by Russia began, this final group started to move to support democracy. Those folks who thought that for people like them, it didn't matter what system they lived in. I think nothing clarifies for you that it matters what system you live in, that a democracy is preferable to an authoritarian state when an authoritarian country is invading your country.
Well, thank you, Olga. I've just got one more question. You've touched on a few things already, but it'd be quite interesting, I think, to sort of have it as a separate question and sum it up. But what do you think foreigners, non-Ukrainians, get most wrong about the Ukrainian Ukrainian politics, the Ukrainian political scene. What are there any myths, any other myths you'd like to sort of bust about it?
Well, I think it's this element of ordinary citizens' attachment, fierce attachment to the state. And that Ukrainians have found a unity in their civic duty and personal engagement in politics. And different Ukrainians from different parts of the country, from different generations, rallied to this position, this fierce attachment to the state, perhaps at different times. But that is such a central feature of Ukrainian politics. And I think people really underestimate it. They really still want to focus on elite actors and the decisions they make, or worse, they are so-called political realists or international relations realists, where they really want to focus on the big players such as the U.S. and Russia, even sometimes forgetting about the EU or the UK and others, as the deciding factors and the actors who make the key decisions that will determine the outcome of the war. I think precisely because Ukrainians have this fierce civic national identity, that is why they have been, that is why they can be rallied by politicians such as Zelensky, but that's also why they themselves rally and mobilize and engage, even without his call to arms. And we've seen that all across Ukraine since February 2022, but I still think that people underestimate it. And it really worries me when people suggest, well, what happens when Ukraine stops getting support from country X, Y, or Z? Well, of course, that will change the scope of the war. Of course, that will make a Ukrainian victory that much more difficult. We have to be sober analysts in that case. But Ukrainians will not stop fighting, right? And Ukrainians will do a better job fighting when they get both the moral and physical support, technical support from their allies and friends. But Ukrainians will not stop fighting. And if anyone thinks that Ukraine can be forced into negotiation, well, they really need to start paying attention to those ordinary citizens.
Well, thank you very much for all of your answers, Olga. I thought that was absolutely fascinating and just what we needed, I think. Roland and Dom and Francis are all listening. Francis, can I go to you first? I know you're on top of a mountain, so do you want to go first with your question?
Thank you, Dave. Yes, it's rather chilly up here. Just a couple of questions, if I may, Olga. Really interesting hearing your insights. The first is, we've spoken on this podcast many months ago, following the invasion, about the significance of Zelensky and those crucial first days of the war. We know, obviously, that within the opening weeks, Russia tried to have him assassinated. How critical do you think Zelensky has played in Ukraine's fight? Do you think, as some do, that if he had been killed, that maybe Ukraine would have, if not fallen, that things would have been in a very, very difficult situation now, compared to the fact that he stood firm and offered a sort of a standard in which Ukraine was able to unite behind? And my second question is, what do you think the future of Ukraine looks like at the end of the war if Ukraine is successful? What kind of new state, shaking off oligarchic power, for instance, do you see Ukraine evolving into?
Right. So first, the Ukraine without Zelensky. I think there's two ways to answer that question. The first is Zelensky played a very important role. His leadership and, the fact that he stayed and he kept making those, in some cases, videos by himself, and not in all cases. Sometimes it is actually him with his phone making these things on his own. Obviously, he has a team to help him out as well. I think that was a huge moral boost to Ukrainians. I think it provided a very good blueprint or example of how other political leaders should be behaving, right? We actually know that there is some evidence that local mayors and town leaders started mimicking his sort of style and substance of communication. And importantly, Zelensky, which he has been doing both in his entertainment, in his shows and theatrical outputs, but then also in his speeches in time as president, prior to the war, he has been doubling down on this idea that what unites Ukrainians is civic values, is the support for democracy, is the determination to defend their democracy and state, and the things that may have been suggested that divide Ukrainians are in fact things that cannot divide them. And he reiterated these messages, these messages of unity and standing together very clearly. At the same time, we cannot suggest that Zelensky is a product of the civic nation he was born into. He is the man he is today because he is part of that independence generation who has lived through so many tumultuous periods of Ukrainians' political past, and because he himself came to rally around the state and to support democracy at some point in his life. Right? So he is a mirror image of the ordinary Ukrainian. And a lot of people that perhaps are supporters of opposition candidates, public intellectuals have also said Zelensky simply did what any dignified Ukrainian would do, and that's stay, fight, support communities, whatever you can, play your part in defending the state. This is why many folks say that there's a 44 million army, and Zelensky is one member of it, albeit, I think, a very important one. Our data also show, by the way, that 80% of the civilian population is engaged in the war effort in some way, whether it's making donations or a variety of volunteer organizations and so on. 80% of the civilian population. So in fact, perhaps Zelensky is just like one of them. Oh, and your second question, oh my gosh, I almost forgot. New Ukraine after, I think Ukraine will have the most important thing Ukraine will have to rebuild, right? Perhaps the sort of thing that we haven't seen in any recent history. That will be extremely costly, but that will also be strategically difficult. So I think the political elite will have to try to maintain their unity in peacetime, because in order to rebuild the country, they will have to make difficult decisions: what goes first, what comes second, what happens simultaneously, and at what cost, and with what help, and how.
Thank you very much, Francis. Roland and Dom. Roland, I know you were slightly pressed for time. Do you want to go next if you have a question?
Yeah. Yes, hello. That was all absolutely fascinating. Thanks very much. I've got a bunch of questions, but I'm going to try and whittle them down into two. I mean, the first blunt one is, do you think the war kind of saved Zelensky in a way? I mean, he was I remember people not being especially happy with him before the war. He turns out to be an incredibly gifted war leader, perhaps because he is a performer, and things like that. But I mean, do you think, how do you think the hypothetical, the invasion never happened, there was no grand war of this scale, what was his kind of political trajectory before the invasion? And the other thing is, I'm interested in everything you said about these focus groups you're doing with Ukrainians, and suddenly there's a shift towards supporting democracy. And you talked about, it's fascinatingly, Russian speakers in the south and east, some people who formerly kind of supported authoritarianism, all of that. But I'm interested in class. I mean, do you have any data about how that crosses, wealth and education lines? I sometimes get the impression that Zelensky kind of represents quite a middle-classish kind of vote. I may be misplaced. But also, there's another answer, that when you're talking about kind of the future of Ukraine and what kind of state emerges afterwards, Open Democracy have done some very interesting reporting about kind of, under the radar kind of stuff, while we're all concentrating in the war, kind of crackdowns on trade unions, some strikes by miners over in West Ukraine, a kind of sense that, to put it bluntly, that kind of labor rights are being eroded, and that the Ukraine that emerges from this war may be slightly more, kind of ravenously free market, perhaps than other parts of Europe. I'm very interested in your take on those questions.
So again, not a simple question, but First off, Zelensky's support. There's a few caveats here that I think when opposition, whether it's intellectuals or opposition politicians, talk about Zelensky's approval ratings, they talk about it in a very particular way. And they also, I think, at times paint, well, shall we say, just a very partisan picture. Zelensky's approval starts off in 2019, actually, prior to his election, at around 23%. Most people don't talk about that. In our data, it goes up certainly in 2020 to 50%, 2021, January, February 2021. So about a year into the pandemic, his approval rating was at what, in our data, a high of 55%. That was quite remarkable in itself because, quite frankly, after just under 2 years in power, and at a time when the pandemic was having a massive negative effect on the social health and economic well-being of the country, for his support to be that high was quite surprising. And then it began to fall in 2021. And it fell by our last data point there in December 2021, February 22 to about 33%, right? So it fell quite dramatically. Yes, and his disapproval rating was higher at that point than his approval rating. But nonetheless, it was higher than where he started out. And more so, I think, when people talk about his approval rating plummeting in a time of pandemic, not surprising whatsoever. It was nowhere near the levels of his predecessors' lows, right? So pretty much it's a pattern that has plagued presidents time and time again in Ukraine, where they have a high approval rating at the beginning, and then it quickly comes to crash. In the case of President Petro Poroshenko, at the same time in his presidency, so around the same marker as we gave the 33% approval rating for Zelensky, Petro Poroshenko's approval rating at that time was 17%. Okay, so less than just about half of what Zelensky's was. So whilst his approval rating fell, and quite dramatically, it did not actually fall as hard and as far to that of his predecessors. And notably, I think Poroshenko is the best comparison because Poroshenko also had a war context and an economic crisis to deal with, albeit he did not have a pandemic to deal with. So that in itself, I think, needs to be taken with a grain of salt. And when people report on it, yes, indeed, people were had a much lower approval rating of him as president. But what does happen also between January, February 2021 and then February 22 in our own data is that his approval of his leadership during the COVID pandemic and his leading on the COVID pandemic actually went higher. So in February 2021, it was 38%. On the eve of Russia's invasion in February 2022, it was 43%. So depending on which measures you look at, you have a slightly different and perhaps a more nuanced idea of where his approval and disapproval rating did fall. When it comes to, I think here, another important question about the class element. And it's not actually, in our analyses when it comes to support for democracy, we do not find a class component that would explain someone moving to democracy or to support for a democratic system as being the best one in Ukraine, or staying in the category of authoritarian or hard to say, or it doesn't matter for people like me which system I live in. So we see class correlation. So we're not doing focus groups, we're doing nationally representative surveys. We're able to really get a good snapshot of the country, and we don't see a class component there. In fact, we have some evidence that Zelensky, following his victory in 2019, was able to not only bring the middle class to support for democracy, because these folks predominantly already supported democracy, but in fact, people that would belong to classes that are considered working class and lower socioeconomic classes in Ukraine. And this matches very well with his messaging, whether it be in his television shows or beyond. He often talked about poverty in Ukraine. He often talked about not being able to buy, meat for dinner, or having to go abroad to work because the way that the Ukrainian economy is set up, it simply cannot accommodate a lot of individuals in employment up until, of course, this period. We're talking about a pre-war period, and during war is very different context. So he, in fact, perhaps rallied actually people from lower socioeconomic classes more to pro-NATO, pro-EU, pro-democracy positions. That's at least what it looks like in the data. So that's not quite the story we're getting there. The folks that oppose him are predominantly of a very particular type of electorate. They are the so-called 25 percenters. They do predominantly come from the west of Ukraine. They tend to be highly educated, and they tend to also identify more strongly with ethno-nationalist ideals of what it means to be a Ukrainian. So the general middle, the median voter in Ukraine, in central Ukraine, in southeast Ukraine, it's a very different story. And support for Zelensky actually among these individuals declined a great deal less. Whether it comes to class structures in Ukraine or neoliberal reforms, certainly wouldn't be the beginning of neoliberal reforms in Ukraine. I don't think it's quite right to describe the issues around unions in the terms that you just did. Most notably because some of these reforms are the reforms that are needed to be in place in order to align with some of the EU regulation. So I think we have to take each one of these instances and reforms separately and discuss it, because they have slightly different beginnings and ends here and aims. But I don't think it's quite clear that is the case, at least not yet. Do I think there is a possibility that the reforms that come in peacetime in Ukraine will be of a neoliberal nature? Yes. Do I think that is potentially a problem, a risk? Yes, potentially so. Do I think Ukraine needs a variety of reforms, including perhaps liberalization of some entities and some industries? Yes, also. So I think it's a little bit more of a complicated story there, but perhaps, hopefully, one that we will get to discuss in greater detail when there is peace in Ukraine.
Dom, can I come to you very quickly, if that's all right, Olga? Just one more question from Dom, and then we can have our final thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks, David. Olga, thanks so much for doing this. Really, really appreciate it. I had two questions, but I'll just ask the one. And thinking, please don't think that we're in any way taking it for granted these great discussions about the politics of your country. We're not taking for granted the effort and the bloodshed still to come to enable people to really answer these. I would have loved, if I was, when I was deployed in the army, I would have loved to have people back discussing the politics at the time. So I think the two are entirely mutually, they're beneficial. When David and I visited your country in July, we had the great pleasure of meeting Mr. Klitschko, Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv. We both had our fists comprehensively squashed by him shaking hands. Now I understand he comes from he's a very much an opponent of President Zelensky, but he's absolutely rallied behind the cause since February the 24th, and he gave no indication. He outright said he's not going to step away from it until the war comes to a successful conclusion. But after that, when the politics returns to quote unquote normality, what are the differences between Zelensky and Klitschko? What do they appeal to? What different sections of society do they appeal to? And where will the cracks be that Russia could seek to widen, unfairly widen? But what are the big policy differences there? Thank you.
So I think Klitschko would be very pleased to hear that he is a possible contender to be a main opponent of Zelensky's in a possible presidential election. I don't think at this time he would be. I just don't think his political reach is large enough, and at this time. And I think there are other folks who would want to come back to the presidency potentially, not least the former president Petro Poroshenko or a close ally of his. If Klitschko would once again strike a deal with Poroshenko in some way, as they did back in 2014, that might be a different story. Klitschko actually was my father's neighbor for quite some time. And my memories of him when I was in my teens and early 20s is that he was the only other person who got up in the morning to jog in the city center of Kiev when jogging was not quite the thing you would do. So I have a very particularly skewed recollection of Klitschko, who was living in the city center and quite frankly, probably a much more modest flat than I think most people would assume. He has been, I think, a very impressive leader in Kiev. Him, his brother, his whole administration have been working, I think, in lockstep with also the Zelensky and his administration and supporting each other where they need to. I think he has also developed a better, more accessible style through his frequent and regular communications to Kievian, to Kievites, or Kiane, as we call them, the residents of Kiev. And I think he's well respected for that. Is he an opponent of Zelensky's? I don't know if he's an opponent. He certainly has been connected to parties that are in opposition, but of course he has his own party as well. So I think there are other potential candidates that would, I think, like to challenge Zelensky in the future. In a peaceful Ukraine. We'll see if Zelensky, in fact, does go up for election again, or if he sticks to his earlier, in fact, campaign promise that he's only going to go for one term. Maybe the war changed that. But I think the main issue for Ukrainian political elite is not to give in to their own ego and ambition, which they have multiple times, and these personalistic fights that they have been engaged in. We talk a lot about in the Zelensky effect over 30 years that really damaged the idea of what it means to be in politics. That is the only place where that could be the schism, the polarization of the political elite in Ukraine that could work to Russia's benefit. I think they know better. I think they're sometimes tempted to, and their ego gets the best of them. But it is important in a democracy to be able to criticize the government. It is important that opponents and various opposition parties are able to engage in the rules of the game of politics and criticize, oppose the government, really get at the difficult policy questions without these personalistic and going back to the old school ways of doing politics in Ukraine. That will be that's the kryptonite for Ukraine if the political elite really fall prey to this divide and rule, and that will be that would be the main nemesis for Ukraine, its own political elite. But I think they know better than that, and at least I know for sure because I've spoken to some people connected to various opposition parties. They know better than that. They know what it means to criticize in a democracy, and where that criticism on policy or action should start and begin, and how you do not try to take down then an entire political party unnecessarily just because you're an opposition.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'll pause there because I see David briefly on. Have I got time for one more question, David?
If we're quick, I realise we've gone massively over time, but this is so fascinating. Thank you, Olga. So only if you're quick, Dom.
All right, steady. Well, it was that question about democracy, Olga. I mean, we see democracy, or rather, Russia sees the messiness of democracy as a weakness and proof of why it should never be attempted, never be tried. Whereas we, those that love democracy, see the cracks and the ugliness, and I guess even the hypocrisy of democracy at times as its strengths, because it's an inherently a human business. I'm no political scientist, but that's it's just me sort of spitballing here. I just wonder where is Ukraine on that spectrum of loving the flaws of democracy or thinking it's terrible? And do you think Russia could ever come over to that? What is stopping Russia from embracing democracy?
I think that's the multi-million, billion-pound question, right? Why is Russia different? And I'll leave that to my colleagues who are Russia experts to try to answer. I do think the civic sense of identity, attachment to the state, and sense of civic duty that has been developed in Ukraine, not only since 1991. We have a long history of Ukrainian dissidents in Ukraine that were Russophones, that were ethnically Russian or belonged to other religious groups or ethnicities, and yet rallied around a civic notion of Ukrainianness. Some of the most famous being, for instance, Ivan Dzyuba, who came from Donetsk and only came to learn Ukrainian in his 20s. He sadly passed away the night after Putin made his first speech to us on February 21st to 22nd, around then. But yes, so there's a long history here in Ukraine, and I think that makes it very different from Russia. Not to say that Russia doesn't have dissidents, activists, civil society members who have tried to do the same. There's something different about the median elector, a median voter in Ukraine and Russia for now. I don't believe in these ideas that something can never happen. Timur Kuran actually has this whole thing about, out of never you have revolutions. And I think that might very well be the case in Russia one day, which will surprise very many people. And perhaps maybe I'm hoping for that. In Ukraine, will they, do Ukrainians love democracy? Well, they've been dealt a very rough and turbulent ride in their democracy. I think that's very much the whole point, again, that we make in the Zelensky effect about the independence generation. These were folks who were, 7 to 14 years old when Ukraine became independent. They were old enough to understand what the Soviet Union was and how hard it was to live in the Soviet Union. But they were certainly too young to do anything once Ukraine became independent. And they had to live through, this wild, wild East version of the 1990s when oligarchs and various mafia clans connected to them would commit murders in city centers, right? Drive-by shootings happened. This was the 1990s. You couldn't buy certain products you could buy very little in stores. People were poor. HIV rates were rising. People were leaving the country en masse. Then you have, the first attempt to restore the direction of Ukraine as democratic in the Orange Revolution. People rise up and then they get massively disappointed because what happens after 2004 and the Orange Revolution is just more and more and more infighting between politicians. And then, of course, Russia plays the gas war card, and then all this turbulence. And then they again elect someone that then proves to be increasingly authoritarian, and they rise up again against this politician, right? They have had one very difficult ride with democracy. And then they're, of course, invaded by their neighbor. Nonetheless, they seem to be doubling down on the things that are important in a democracy. So they value democracy as a system. They think that their role in it is to engage the sense of civic duty that is also growing amongst Ukrainians. We're talking 80-something% of Ukrainians think it's their civic duty to vote. Voting is not obligatory. About half of the population think it's their duty to engage in other extra institutional civil society activities. Can you imagine saying those same things about many other countries? Probably not. So, even in the face of turbulence and this wild ride of the democracy that did exist, I think ordinary Ukrainians remain, for whatever amazing and miraculous reason, dedicated to the hope that their democracy in the future will be better. But they see themselves again as the main actor in that democracy. So if Zelensky messes up, if Zelensky, well, whether engages in a negotiation that the median voter does not support or messes up in some other way, the Ukrainian electorate, the Ukrainian citizens will put him in his place as well. I think so far they think he hasn't done that. But they did that to also Poroshenko in 2019. Poroshenko, there's a lot of wonderful things we can talk about Poroshenko's time as president. We can also talk about the fact that he is one of the major oligarchs, that he did rely on personalistic rule and family friendships and ties in his policy and politics. We can also talk about other problems that occurred during his presidency. The citizens definitely showed him where they stood when it came to him trying to come back to power. And they did that time and again with others. So take that as you want. These Ukrainians, they are committed to their democracy. And I guess that's what inspires us about them.
Well, thank you so much, Olga. We've covered so much in almost an hour and 20 minutes. So thank you so much for your time, and apologies for running over. Thank you for answering all of our questions. Just very quickly, Roland and Dom, can I get your final thoughts? And then we'll leave the very final thought to Olga. And do tell us again about your book, which I believe is coming out tomorrow. So Roland or Dom, would you like to go first?
I can go first, that's fine. I think that was really, really good kind of summary of things about Ukraine we don't often think about when we're talking so much about the war. So thank you very, very much. Olga, I'd like to say I completely agree with what she was saying about, Ukrainians' attitudes to their leaders. When I've spoken to Ukrainian soldiers or civilians, saying, haven't you got a great president? Look what he's doing. The reaction is generally, well, it's his job. If he wasn't doing it, he'd be in trouble. So I fully kind of recognise that description of Ukraine. Final thoughts on the China thing. I think there's going to be a lot of attempts to kind of push this as a major shift in China's policy. I think it's much more nuanced there. So don't necessarily imagine that President Xi is going to rip up his alliance with Putin, but it's definitely something we should be keeping an eye on, because those kinds of very small, very slow tectonic movements in the diplomatic landscape will contribute one way or another to the end of this war and what the world looks like afterwards. And the last thing is, of course, we were talking a lot about Poland and the strikes. Don't forget about the impact of that on Ukraine. Huge parts of the country without power. I was speaking to someone in Kiev the other day who was having to climb 21 stories to get back to their flat because the electricity for lifts are out. So still very intense kind of deliberate targeting of basically life. You could say civilians, but life, trying to make life impossible. That is the challenge for large numbers of Ukrainians today.
Thanks, Roland. Dom Nichols.
Thanks, David. So my final thought, I would just say, with the strike in Poland, we still don't know quite what it is, quite what it's coming out to be. But from what we're looking at so far, it seems as if the frothy chatter going around last night on social media, which has slipped into some of the press today, seems to have been slightly wide of the mark. And I think the leaders of NATO have passed a test that they wouldn't have wished, of course, but I think they've handled this pretty well. And I think their cool approach to this immediate crisis was handled appropriately, and their language was couched in all the correct terms. And I think we are the better for it. As I say, they wouldn't wish this test on them, but actually, given the possible tests to come, this was not a bad one to have under the belt. So well done, I think, NATO.
Well, thank you, Roland. Thank you, Dom. And Olga, I'll leave you with the very final thought.
So I couldn't agree more with the comments made by Dominic and Roland just now. Clearly, Russia is becoming a potential liability for China. And I think, again, maybe not tectonic shifts, but even slight ripples can have a dramatic effect on Russia, but also on Putin, and psychologically losing support or losing whatever is left of that support. And again, the massive attacks on Ukrainian civilians. I've obviously talked a lot about the inspirational story of ordinary Ukrainians over time, but it is about psychologically torturing ordinary Ukrainians, physically and psychologically, having to live in darkness, having to put on your coat and 3 different jumpers, and it's maybe some people in Europe also going through this winter, but not having any option to get warm, is trying to get psychologically at the ordinary population. Our early data suggest that it has, again, the opposite effect, that people become more entrenched in their determination not to negotiate. They become more entrenched in their will to fight to the end. So, that is an interesting, I think, also development. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. And just very quickly, when does your book come out and how can people follow your work?
Oh, yes. My book is it's Henry Hale and myself. And it is actually due out in this week, next week. It should be in stores across the United Kingdom. You can order it online. If you're in Europe, you can also order it online to have it delivered. And it will be out in the US with Oxford University Press. In the UK, it's out with Hearst. In the US, it will be out in March in stores. So it's a slightly delayed release. But if I may say so myself, quite the nice Christmas stocking stuffer for all those who like the nerdy bits. There's plenty of nerdy bits in there, including analyses and appendices. For all those who like an interesting story, there's also a lot of quotes from songs and from shows and from theatrical appearances. So we cover a little bit of everything. And if you're a political nerd, you will, I think, really like reading the book about Ukraine's political history.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast by The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can also listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, do leave a review, as it helps others find the show. To our listeners on YouTube, for reasons beyond our control, there's sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you do want to hear an episode as soon as possible, it's available on your podcast apps. Please search for Ukraine the Latest on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred app, and check out the Ukraine page on the Telegraph website. As ever, you can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.